Admiral Bauer, you spent several years at the head of NATO's military committee. What do you make of these reports coming out of DC that the US is planning to punish countries that haven't taken part in the war in Iran?
I would say it is extremely important to look at what the US is doing versus what some people in the US are saying. And by that I mean that over the last year, a little bit more than a year, we've heard a lot of things being said which not necessarily have led to changes in NATO, for example. So we've heard about troops being withdrawn from Europe. There's not one soldier moved out of Europe by now. There was of course Greenland, which didn't happen. So I think it is extremely important to look at what the US actually is doing versus what they're saying. The question, of course, is it helpful that they sometimes or very often say these things? Then I would say no, it's not necessarily helpful. But the good news, I think, in general, is that for Europeans and for Canada, people start to understand it's not enough to understand there is a wake-up call, but you now also have to get out of bed. And that means that you need to do things differently. And one of the things that I believe Europeans and Canadians are understanding more and more is that they need to become more involved in the defense of their own country and of Europe and Canada and, of course, NATO as a whole. That was proven by the Hague Summit with the money discussion and the capability targets. But then the next step is more important, and that is that we make sure there is an industry that can actually produce the things that we need, that we want to buy. So instead of focusing on only the political issues that time and time sort of flare up, whether NATO is united and whether there is tensions in the alliance, which can be true, but we need to solve a number of things, practical things as well, which is, for example, the defense production capacity in Europe and in North America, which is still not ramped up as it should. We're in year 5 of the war in Ukraine, and we're still discussing with each other and trying to convince each other to ramp up that production capacity.
So am I understanding you right in saying that European leaders are still overreacting to these kinds of stories? Are they taking it kind of too seriously?
I didn't say that. I leave every reaction of every political leader to themselves. But what I say is that, first of all, if you look back over the history of NATO, there's been storms in the alliance, and we've weathered them together. In 1966, the French left the military organization, returned in 2009. The Greek and the Turks have had their problems over time. And of course, the big difference then is people say, journalists say to me, this is the United States of America, the biggest ally, that is saying all these things. And yes, it's not helpful. And yes, I do not agree with a lot of things that President Trump said. However, what I do agree with him is that he forced us to focus on defense again. And he said it's ridiculous that Europeans and Canadians didn't take any responsibility for their own defense. And so, as Secretary General Rutte has said, without President Trump, we would not have been at 2%, all the allies now, and we would not have had the 3.5%, 5% decision in The Hague, and we would have not agreed to the capability target. So it's not all bad what comes out of the US. Again, is it helpful always? Not necessarily, but we should stay calm and carry on. And carrying on means actually doing what we have promised. And we have promised to strengthen the European part of the alliance. And that means that we need to buy these capabilities, that we need to get the money, that we need to make sure there is an industry that actually can produce it. Because in, let's say, the hyper-focus on efficiency and accountability over the last 40 years has resulted in a just-in-time, just-enough economy, which cannot respond to peak demand signals as we've seen in a pandemic and now in a war. So that's what we have to do. So there is political turmoil, I agree, but at the same time, if we do in Europe and Canada what we have promised, we will have capabilities that now only the US has, and as a result, we will become more powerful as European nations and Canada, which means that you will have a different discussion with the US.
You mentioned about ramping up capacities and that that's still something being talked about now in year 5 of this war. Has NATO been too slow to react to this war on its doorstep here in Ukraine? And over the last year, we've seen US military aid going down to basically zero in terms of things provided to Ukraine rather than sold. How far have you seen Europe actually filling that gap in terms of deliveries?
There's multiple questions in your question, because you talk about NATO and Europe, and that's not necessarily always the same. So everybody talks about NATO as if it is a magical thing. NATO is what the countries make of it. So if NATO, which is all the nations in the alliance, have taken a decision, as in The Hague with the capability targets and the money decisions on 3.5% and 5%, then it is then up to the nations to actually do that, to deliver on their promise. So if people say, has NATO done enough, then it is not necessarily a direct task of NATO to produce the weapons, because that is in the nations. That is an industrial policy, for example, of an ally. And I think the EU can play an important role there in Europe, because the EU has a more powerful, has better instruments, so to say, than NATO to, for example, influence the industrial policies in the member states and as an organization, as a multinational organization as a whole. So I think the combination of the decisions in NATO on standards and on what is required, which is the capability target. The capability target is basically the shopping list per nation, what they need to buy to be able to execute the military plans the nations have agreed to. So that is what NATO has done. And so now it is up to the nations to deliver on those targets. And the nations for that need to do what they have promised on the money side, find the money. And second, of course, to make sure there is enough industry and enough capacity in that industry to produce all the weapons that we actually need. And so that combination means that EU and NATO should work together. Many of the nations are in both organizations. And therefore, it shouldn't be too difficult to actually agree on that, although it might be different ministers that talk about that subject in the EU when it comes to these topics than in NATO. But so I think it is all solvable, and we have the money, we have the intelligence, we have everything basically to solve these problems. But we need to focus, and we need to make sure that we want to solve it tomorrow. And we are still talking about it. And the reason for that is probably that the sense of urgency is not there yet.
Is Ukraine right now getting enough to not lose rather than to win, or to get to some kind of sustainable resolution here?
Again, it's a good question. I think it's not helpful if the US is giving less to Ukraine. It's not helpful if a lot of weapons are being fired in the Middle East, and as a result, less weapons can go to Ukraine. Even weapons that Europe has bought in America for Ukraine, because of the priority that the industry has to give to its own nation, for example. So it's not helpful. It's remarkable how creative and Ukraine has been in terms of compensating, in terms of technology and solutions, for the lack of weapons that they originally wanted to buy from us or get from us. And the attack drones is a good example, where 70% of the Shahed drones are now being taken out by Ukrainian weapons, not Patriot missiles. So in a way, Ukraine has compensated for the fact that the assistance is coming down. Do they get enough? I'm not privy to all the intelligence that I had when I was working in NATO, of course. So as a private citizen, I read the newspapers. But I think Ukraine is doing remarkably well at the front. Of course, it's terrible that the war is still going on. There's too many people dying. But if you look at the results at the front, actually Ukraine is taking back territory over the last couple of months. Ukraine is relatively successful in fighting the missiles and the drones that the Russians are firing at them. So is it enough to not lose the war? At the moment, I would say yes. Is it enough to win the war? The answer is, I guess, no. Should we continue to support Ukraine? My answer is absolutely yes. It is important for the case that a sovereign state has been attacked, and therefore we have to prevent together internationally as the international community that a sovereign state cannot be taken by another state. So that is in all our interest, but it is also in the interest of the security of Europe that Ukraine is not losing this war. And it is fascinating that a country like China, for example, said to Kaja Kallas, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China, said 2, 3, 4 months ago that it is for them unacceptable if Russia would lose the war. He didn't say that it was necessary for Russia to win the war. So that says a lot, because it actually shows that China is interested in weakening Europe and the US, but actually is also, in a way, interested in weakening Russia. Because as the longer the war lasts, it is in the interest of China, because we spend a lot of money and weapons, etc., to support Ukraine, and the Russians spend a lot of money and weapons and lives to win the war in Ukraine. And the only one that is the sort of laughing third is China.